HR Unboxed with Natalie and Faye.
Welcome to episode 3 of HR Unboxed with Natalie and Faye from Rebox HR.
Good morning, Chris. It's lovely to be here and, of course, in your shiny new studio.
I know, you're the first ones in our new studio. How are you feeling, Faye?
Really good, thank you. Very excited to get episode 3 underway.
It is a little more public here, I've got to be honest. There's a lot of people walking past watching us through the window, but hopefully we're not going to let us get too distracted by that. So today we're getting down to the nitty-gritty, aren't we? We can talk about all those nitty-gritty issues with HR.
Yeah, absolutely. So a huge thank you to all of the listeners once again. We've had a really wonderful response to the podcast, and it's really exciting to get some information from people that are looking to Faye and I to talk about their HR dilemmas as well. So keep the emails coming.
Yeah, and I think lots of really interesting feedback has come in and lots of views and lots of listens to our podcast. So thanks to everyone that's been tuning in. It's been phenomenal, really. I didn't realise HR was so captivating to people, but I think it really touches a nerve with a lot of businesses and a lot of people that have to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I think so. It's one of those where people don't really know what goes on behind the closed door. So Faye and I, with this podcast, aim to bring that to life a little bit. Obviously anonymously, we're not going to name people or name companies online or things like that. If we're discussing tribunal cases, then yes, we will obviously refer to what the case and the outcome to that was. But ultimately, Faye and I really want to bring HR to life for people, because a lot of people just don't know what goes on behind that office door.
And it literally is a closed door, because when there's a serious HR meeting, that's when the door shuts and you think, oh, what's going on in there? I wish I could be a fly on the wall. And you get to do that, but more than a fly on the wall, you have to actually, chair the meetings and do all the difficult stuff. But yeah, it must be very interesting to kind of see behind the scenes what's going on.
It is. I mean, one thing that we'd never wanted to do, and we had this in one of our first offices that Natalie and I were accommodating, and we didn't want to be seen as the head teacher's office at the bottom of a corridor, and it's kind of dark and gloomy, and you're sent to HR and there's almost waiting seats outside, and we never wanted to portray ourselves in that way. I mean, we've come across a few clients and they've said, how are you both so jovial? How are you both so kind of fun and add humour to what we do? And I honestly believe if sometimes if we didn't laugh, we'd actually cry about it. But honestly, I think having that, it seems like a closed door, but what we're trying to do, or at least to try and evidence to do with our clients, is to create a more open door policy. Now, so many different issues coming to light where communication is key. So we don't want to close that off between HR clients, HR employees, and so what. So yeah, that's what our aim is. Yeah.
Fantastic. So have we had any interesting cases come in on the emails over the last couple of weeks?
Oh, we have.
What's kind of the word on people's lips now? So we're sort of getting into autumn time, aren't we? Getting through the summer, heading towards Christmas, getting towards sort of Halloween. I don't know if there's any pumpkin related HR faux pas that we need to be wary of. What's on everyone's lips at the moment?
It's a mixture of different things, but the two common themes that Faye and I are coming up against are issues with employee absence and how to manage it. We've got a lot of issues relating to mental health at work, and almost in a situation where employers are too scared to approach that person and discuss it, but on the level rather than coming from a policy place. We don't treat people like human policies, as Faye quite adequately puts it. So it's one of those where it's an absolute adamant thing where we have to make sure that we're doing things in the right way.
Fantastic. So obviously with a lot of absence, it's kind of something where you don't necessarily want to admit the reason for the absence. It's like with school holidays. When you take your kids out of school in the summer because it's cheaper, you kind of ring up the school and say that the kids are ill, and a lot of people do that. I'm not encouraging it, but it's apparently a cheaper way to do things. Do you find that as well in the workplace, that people claim to be ill because they haven't got enough days left on their annual leave and they're kind of sneaking off? And is there a way of policing that? Is it your word against theirs?
So this was actually one of the emails that we received, was around what we call patterned absence. Now, when employees are given a contract of employment,
what happens is they'll go through that, and sometimes we'll find that the sickness leave entitlement is bolted on as additional holiday because they see it as an entitlement rather than it being something that should be utilised when it's absolutely necessary. And we're not saying that all employees do this, but from an employer's perspective, it's very difficult to manage because they are not able to question the validity of somebody's absence. But if we are able to look at things concisely as a picture, then what we are able to establish is actually, is there something else at play here? You know, what's the engagement levels like of the organisation? Because people will work to rule, so to speak, is the phrase that most use. And that is often when they feel disengaged with the business that they work for. So without getting too complicated on that, in terms of managing absence, the theme of this podcast is essentially going to be nip these issues in the bud because they quickly escalate into something else. So if you allow it to happen 1 year and they've bolted on their sickness absence, then you're going to expect them to do it the next year and the year after that. And the employee, unless it's addressed to them, they're not going to know any different and they're going to keep doing it, which managers get frustrated with because they're not sure how to manage it. But also there isn't often the expertise within the business to advise them on how to approach these conversations, which is where Faye and I come in.
Yeah, because I think it's quite a difficult thing when you know what's going on, but you haven't got any proof, and there is a pattern, and you're like, yeah, I can see that you've been off every second Monday consistently for the last 6 months. You know, are you really ill and it happens to always be on a Monday morning, or are you having some nice long weekend breaks? And I don't know, it's how you have those conversations without feeling like you're going to cross a line yourself as the boss and that you're going to get in trouble by accusing them of something that you can't prove.
Yeah, I think so, Faye, and I get that all the time.
Yeah, I think it's really important. This is where it comes into ensuring that managers conduct return to work interviews. And we can't stress that enough. So if you've had employees absent on their first day of return to work, bring them into the office, have that open conversation with them. I mean, there's templates and scripts you can follow just so you don't go off piece in case, I understand that people are so worried in what they're saying to employees, but you can ask the question, why were you ill? Let's get that documented. And I think sometimes it can go on for such a long time. We could get a call in and they say, I've got these absence issues, and we'd expect maybe, 2 or 3 occasions. And it's 19 occasions or a Bradford factor into the hundreds, and you ask the question, where...
Hang on, what's the Bradford factor? That sounds exciting. Is that like when you measure how fast the wind is?
It's a calculation just based, our system that we currently use, Breathe HR, actually has this functionality on there. And what it does is it measures somebody's absence in case of the amount of actual cases there are and for the longevity of how often they were off. So you'd probably expect it if you was off on one particular instance, but then you had that stretched over a few days, that would go down as 1. But then if you had then another, and what it does is the amount of it, the Bradford factor itself actually grows. It's a way of just measuring how long over, say, a 12-month rolling period somebody's had, and the higher the number, the worse the situation is, unfortunately.
And if they fail on the Bradford factor, do they have to go through to judges' houses and then the elimination
Yeah, I mean, there is, we say hot seat. I mean, they may be in one if they've reached trigger points. Now,
trigger point? Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, it gets better. So, without
so
going
you have
into
a giant coin drop machine.
I know. Yeah, so I was going to say, without going into all these different programs that you can see on
daytime TV,
on your daytime
classics.
TV, some of our clients and some companies alike, they put in some trigger points. So what that does is identify when they reach whatever that looks like. It could be 3-4 absences over a rolling 6-month, 12-month period. Once they hit that, they're brought in. What's going on? Let's have a conversation. Let's find out if there's anything that the company can do to support. We're not sitting them in the chair to have, to be told off. We just want that conversation to find out what's going on. Is this a recurring problem, illness, or thing that you're experiencing? And what can we do to help with that? We don't know if we're not told.
Absolutely, and you've got to have some way of measuring it, so it's objective, and you can say, look, it's not me, it's the Bradford Factor.
Yeah.
And if you've not seen it, here's a link to watch it on YouTube.
Yeah.
But you've failed the Bradford Factor. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's like the Krypton Factor. Do you remember that? Too young.
Yeah, Faye and I would love to do something like that in terms of, you see these exciting team building days.
Yeah.
We'd love to do something like that. And we've recently welcomed a new team member. So I think we'll just throw them in at the deep end and see, if they can make the Rebox Factor. Like,
The Rebox Factor. This is great. Yeah.
Isn't it? So you could do job interviews like that. Can you imagine? And it's like Takeshi's Castle, but with job applicants.
So who's your new team member? Should we give them a shout out?
So Mark joined the team. Well, say that he's new. He's been there pretty much since Rebox started, but in an unofficial capacity. So he started officially 2 months ago now, and is finding his feet and meeting with our clients now. So now we're able to take on new projects and, of course, new clients as well. So it's been something that I've had to be aware of as a business owner, because ultimately, Faye, there's only so much you can put on your employees, and when you've got so much time that you have to allocate to various projects and service delivery in the way that we do, we have to make sure that we're available for our clients, and we've recognised that, haven't we? And we've put that right now by bringing Mark on board so that our clients get a much more streamlined service.
Brilliant. I did have one quick question though, going back to the holiday, the kind of unauthorised holiday absence. We don't know what they were doing, but people being off and you're not sure why. Is it okay to check out your team's social media to see what they're up to when they're off sick, or is that an invasion of privacy? If you see them with those kind of sausage knee photos from the beach when they're supposed to be off sick?
I hate to give you this answer, Chris, but it is the age-old HR. It depends. And when we're looking at absences, we don't look at them just as a blanket approach, which is where a lot of employers go wrong. So when you're looking at it on a case-by-case basis, you can have a look through patterns previously. We often get the issue, and this is actually one of the questions that one of our listeners has sent in, is an employee has said to us that we've declined their holiday because operationally we're not able to allow them to have the time off because they've got too many other people on. So essentially they've said, well, I'm taking it anyway. And that's from the employee, has said, well, I'm going to take that holiday anyway. And the employer said, well, what can we do about it? Can you answer that question for us on the podcast? So yes, there is something you can do about it. It's called pre-planned unauthorised absence. And I know that we're going to get a few more emails to follow this up. So just to answer the question in one answer is, yes, it is gross misconduct. So employees also need to be aware of their obligations when they sign a contract of employment. Most people that get a contract won't even read it. They will just sign it at the bottom and hope for the best, which is never a good thing, because technically that's your contract with your employer to say, I will give you my services from 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, and we want you to I get paid as recompense for that. So it is a service agreement between two parties. Now, employees are very aware of their rights these days, which is keeping Faye and I incredibly busy. And it's not to say that employers out there are bad employers. It's because the pace of the changes that we actually covered in episode 2, we're seeing huge changes in employment law now. Businesses just can't afford to wing this.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. You're up against staff who sometimes might know employment law as well or better than you do as an employer, but it's so disrespectful that they come up and they're like, yeah, I'm going to have some pre-planned unauthorized absence. What are you going to do about it? I feel like I'm entitled to this. I feel like I might be ill next Tuesday.
Yeah.
But there is something you can do.
There is, and if they do come up against a situation like that, obviously seek support from your HR person, or you can come and speak to Faye and I. We are very open book. We're on LinkedIn all the time. So if people DM us or ask us questions, we're more than happy to discuss anything with them. And we do offer a free consultation. The reason I started the business in the first place was not to charge the earth for HR, because, that's what large scale organisations do, so we are very cost efficient in that way. But I do believe that HR should be accessible for everyone, but it needs to be with a commercial focus, which is what Faye and I really bring to the table and makes us different.
Yeah, and I think that's lovely that you can give advice, but obviously if you want the full practical help and access to all of your documents and that library of useful letters and things that you have, then obviously become a client. But advice is just being nice, isn't it? Just sharing the knowledge.
Absolutely, that's what it's all about, and that's how HR should be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a dark art though, isn't it? There's so much mystery around it, and there's so many misconceptions about what you can and can't do and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and this is why this is so interesting, this whole subject. So is there anything else that's hot on people's lips at the moment? Any other kind of big topics?
Performance. Faye and I get calls daily about performance, which is just something else. And I know, Faye and I are very kind people, and those that know us know that we will do things in an ethical and supportive way. It's not done to get at people, which I think HR is also got this association with, which couldn't be further from the truth. So when we're looking at cases surrounding performance issues, the one thing that Faye and I really come up against time and time again, and one of the emails does say this, is that I've tried to do right by my employee. They weren't particularly good in this role. So what we've done is we've created another role for them. And they're not performing in this role now. So I'm going to create another role here for them. So the employee thinks they're progressing, and we call it a classic setting up to fail, don't we? And it's because the employer doesn't want to see that person out of work. They're doing it through what
Pity.
they deem as kindness, but it's not. You're quite right. It can be pity, but what that throws up and what Faye and I have to deal with is the whole fallout from that, because the employee, as far as they're concerned, they've not done anything wrong. Their performance is fine, but the employer is like, oh yeah, and I should have addressed it, but I didn't want to upset them and things like that. So we are seeing the opposite end of the spectrum, aren't we?
Yeah.
Is it because people don't like having difficult conversations? And telling somebody that they're not performing is really awkward, especially when you're working together. Maybe it's a small team, it's a small business, and you're good friends. These are your colleagues, and you don't want to be seen as Mr. Nasty saying to somebody, you're costing us more than you're bringing in every month. You're a liability to this company.
Yeah, I think some managers, employers, I think they don't want to rock the boat. I think by doing that, and maybe how they see it, that going out into their team and saying you're not really performing and you could be doing better. Nobody wants to have those conversations. It's kind of the negative side of managing people, essentially, because you are having to be the person to correct and put forward what those expectations look like. But only by having those conversations can you do that. So one thing also is that other team members around that, if they see somebody completely underperforming and they're not kind of pulling their weight, and everything's then on, say, 3 or 4 other members of the team, they're going to become quickly disgruntled and bring that up to management. Or it's just not going to be a nice situation for anybody, and that starts creating more of a toxic workplace, because then people become unhappy and they're thinking, well, why aren't you pulling this person up? Why aren't you telling them? Not cracking the whip, we're not suggesting that, but just have that conversation and say, you really do need to be helping out more. We need to start seeing this from you. Doesn't have to be negative points attached to that. Let's talk about the supportive approach. Let's talk about what we can do to get their performance to level up.
And I think it's leadership really more than anything, isn't it? And sometimes people want to have that kind of oversight. They want to have somebody as a mentor to help them perform well. And I think my advice would be, people know when they're not performing and they feel bad about it, and having it as like the elephant in the room that you don't talk about isn't helping anybody. It makes your team members feel like you don't care how well they're performing, and sometimes it's nice to have that conversation with people if you do it in the right way.
Yeah, I think also that then goes back to the well performers, the ones that are doing good, because then you think, well, are you even recognizing how well we're doing, because the other person doesn't seem to be pulled up for not doing as well. And sometimes that then it creates this almost barrier in a team, and that's then where fallout issues start to occur. So I think from the get-go, when that situation presents itself, I think managers jumping on that to say, well, actually, we need to start putting this in place, or, oh, can I just have a quick conversation? I can see you're struggling with this task. What can we do? Can we help mitigate? Can we delegate some of the tasks for you? Because then you're kind of nipping it in the bud, so to speak, before it begins a big performance problem for you.
Yeah, and often managers are put into this position where they are star performers, so to speak, and then, oh, you're really good at your job, Dave, so what we're going to do is we're going to promote you, and you're a manager, but we're not going to give you the tools to manage the people. You've just got to acquire the skills yourself to do that, which never works. So a lot of people that are coming to us as a company are saying, can you train our managers and enable them to, manage these difficult conversations and to identify where to nip these issues in the bud before they have a chance to escalate. So Faye and I call them accidental managers because they've kind of fallen into the role because they're good at their job, but then the issue that they get is then they're then criticised for not being able to manage the personalities that are within the team. But another factor to consider is that the people that are the ones that Faye has just described, and they may not necessarily be performing, a lot of time and attention from that manager is distracted onto those people. So the star performers and those that are what we call the steady Eddie category, the guys that turn up every day, they're loyal as anything, they're brilliant at their job, but they'll just get the job done. But they don't expect that recognition. They just prefer to carry on and bob along day to day. Steady Eddies. So when we got those characters involved, the guys that are physically doing the work, and if you've got someone who's utilising each policy to make it suit their narrative, it stops those people from getting that valuable time with their manager because they're too busy with, the chap that's going off sick every 5 minutes or isn't performing right, that they're trying to put essentially a square peg into a round hole.
It is really difficult, isn't it? And I think you're right. A lot of the time people become managers because they're good at their jobs, not because they're good managers or good leaders. And that's the difficult difference. And I think it's very easy to think, oh, well, if I praise everybody except the person that's not performing, he'll realise. Yeah. And go around the office going, you've done great this week. You've done great this week.
Yeah.
You've done great this week. Great job. People do notice that, but they don't feel like they're getting any feedback. They just feel like you're weak and uninspiring, really. Yeah. So yeah, it's a tough one. And I guess your role is to kind of say, look, to the managers, do you feel like maybe you should go on a course or get some training on people management, because this seems to be the issue in the team. It's not them, it's you.
I think it's important that they get training that suits what it is that they are looking for, rather than it being a general course, because we see this quite often, don't we, where managers have been, but I've done a people management course and now I can manage people effectively, until the practice works with, the experience hand in hand. The people were coming to us because they don't have time to provide that experience down to that middle management category. So they're being really forgotten about. And they always say that people leave bad managers. It's not about the job, it's about how they've been managed. But sometimes they have to look at, well, what are the other things that the manager's having to cope and deal with at the same time. But people generally don't think outside of what affects them. So that is also causing quite a knock-on effect in organisations, because that comes across as from a manager as, well, my employee doesn't care, or they're disengaged and things like that. So a lot of these things can be nipped in the bud by some very, very simple frameworks. And I'm quite controversial when I say this, is that the annual appraisal needs to get in the bin. We don't like it. No, Faye and I don't like it. And we don't find that it's practical for those that are, it should be an ongoing process. They should have access to their manager, when they need to, not a case of, you've got to wait until October to meet with me.
It can be a bit of a box ticking exercise, can't it? And it's like, yeah, right, I've given you attention, we've done your appraisal, there, you should be fine for a year. I don't have to worry about you anymore. What more do you do? Yeah.
The manager sat there going, well, what do you want, a cookie? Come
on, guys.
Yeah, exactly. It's the whole age of bringing an apple to your teacher's desk almost, isn't it? And I just don't think that they're constructive. Yes, if you've got the right appraisal frameworks in place and they work, they're not linked to pay. A lot of people think appraisal should be linked to pay, but we completely disagree with that, because Chris, if I was appraising, or if you were appraising me and you said, Natalie, you're great at all of these things, but out of a score of 5, with 5 being the best, I'm going to give you a 4. I'm going to say, Chris, I'm a 5.
I'd be like, Natalie, you've had 3,700 downloads of your podcast, but we were expecting 3,800. So I'm sorry, it's only a 4 this week. Mark. You've missed it. Yeah.
Missed the mark completely on that one. But yeah, it's one of those where it has to be constructive and it has to work for the business, because if your managers don't want to do it and they're filling in a form and they can't be bothered, and the employee's turning up and said, I didn't fill in that form that you gave me 2 months ago, it's really counterproductive. It's a waste of everybody's time. So Faye and I work with businesses to put in a replacement to the appraisal. So it can look as simple as a monthly one-to-one with those staff, so that they've got allocated time and they can talk about these things. Some are a lot less informal and they will do it as and when the employee is ready. So they leave the onus on the employee to say, we're not going to badger you, come to us when you feel comfortable. And we find that works quite well with people with learning difficulties in organisations, people who are on the autistic spectrum. And those that are just classic introverts. I've got lots of friends that are introverts that go, I couldn't think of anything worse than being called into my manager's office because I don't know what it's about. And they have a tendency to sometimes overthink these things. And I've had meetings this week where I've gone into a client site and the staff have been terrified of me. They've never met me before, but they've said, oh, no, we've had a bad experience with HR in the past, I'll be honest, and I don't want to get anyone into trouble. And I just want to check in, see how you're doing. So you do have to be very careful and tactful with how you approach any process, but the word appraisal just fills people with dread.
I completely agree, and I think, like a lot of people, I just don't like being judged. I don't care whether I do well or not. It's just the process of somebody. That's why I hated driving tests and things like that. Just having somebody sat next to you as you're driving your car, just with a little clipboard, just writing down his judgment of you constantly. It's just the most off-putting, and it's horrible.
Yeah, employees and employers feel no different, do they, Faye?
I think by trying to assess if somebody's a 1 or 5, I mean, how that's measured is going to be completely different across each board that you come across. I don't know how you become a 5. I can't even give you the pinpoints of what that looks like. But I kind of think that by stacking all your woes or all your good celebratory points and bullet pointing them ready for this 1 year conversation that you're going to have is not conducive to anybody. I think that is a continuous conversation. You would not wait a year before, having to cite all the problems that you've come across and say, oh, by the way, back in March, had this problem. Waited till now to tell you about that, because that really could become a real problem, especially if they don't think that your door is going to be open anytime up until then. They could think, I'll wait for that appraisal, or again, even on the nicer spectrum of it, you don't want to wait for the whole year to say, do you know what, really good job on that project you did in May. Nobody wants that. Let's talk about it real time. Let's have those conversations in real time, because again, if there's any inconsistencies, any discrepancies with work tasks or otherwise, they can be nipped in the bud. And we keep coming back to that phrase, but it's about just dealing with things as it arises. Don't wait, don't sit on things.
No.
And I think the other thing with appraisals is sometimes bad managers use them to kind of take the action they've already decided they're going to take. So if they've decided they don't want to give anyone a pay rise, nobody's going to get a 5 out of 5. Everyone's going to get a 4 out of 5. There's nothing you can do. It's a foregone conclusion. If they've decided, you're not performing, then whatever you say and whatever evidence you bring to your appraisal is not going to make a blind bit of difference, because they've already decided what their opinion of you is. And I think that's why people feel they're unfair sometimes, because it's not the process necessarily. It's just you don't trust your boss, and you don't feel like you're getting a fair crack of the whip.
And managers don't like going into these appraisals either. They often, if they've got bad, if we don't call it bad feedback, but if they've got feedback that they have to deliver that isn't positive, they often, you'll find that the managers will be sat there with this piece of paper in front of them shaking, because they are just as anxious and apprehensive about the process as anybody, but they feel that it's an exercise they actually have to do. Whereas if they are seeing their people every day, and, what's the harm in them saying, I'm just checking in on you while I'm at the coffee machine, or, that they're actually together. Why does it have to wait all that time where it can build up and it can escalate? Because that employee might have an issue that they feel that they're not able to raise, and the manager might not know how to deliver the feedback, which then ends up in a very mishmash of a meeting where neither party can agree. And this is when we start to see grievances and issues with conduct appear. So we have to be really mindful about how we approach the process, what message has to be delivered. So essentially a lot of what Faye and I do is coach these managers through the process to make sure they're doing right, not just by the person, but they're doing the right thing by the business as well, because it's all about balance.
I think also from the manager's point of view, sometimes you have an employee who's really articulate, really sassy, really cocky. They know what to say, and they think really quickly, and you're a bit terrified of doing an appraisal with them, because they're going to run rings around you as a manager.
Yeah.
And they're going to be in control of the meeting in a lot of ways, and it's quite difficult to kind of keep in control and be their boss. And I think a lot of the time when you've got people that are probably cleverer than their bosses, or more experienced, or more older potentially,
yep,
it can be quite an intimidating thing for a manager to try and deal with members of the team that are like that.
And they're dealing with both levels, aren't they, Faye? So they've got their bosses expecting their teams to deliver, and the manager's in the middle of this, and the employee, but they may not want to deliver the message upwards either. So to be a manager is actually it's a real challenge for people. So the more people that we get to work with and encourage things in the right way and get mechanisms that work, it's much more productive and makes the whole process more efficient. So it's not just a case of ticking boxes. Yes, we do need to meet with our employees, and yes, we do need to have open channels of communication. But when that miscommunication is seen on either side, whether it is miscommunication or not, is something that really does need to be identified. And again, it's all about nipping it in the bud.
Nipping it in the bud. The nitty-gritty. Okay, cool. Have we got anything else that we need to touch on this time on the podcast? Faye, what have you got?
I think if we're leaving it with sort of a message, definitely surrounding the points we've spoken about today, I think, you can see that you may have some employees that are absolute star performers, but then there might be an issue, and they might be late every day, and you think, I won't address that with them because, they do really well at their job, so we'll let the other thing go until they can't, and then they need to address it, then there's a problem. And there's multiple instances and multiple issues that we can see that are around that kind of situation, that I just feel that having the conversation, it does go back to that, and just being able to tell people what the expectations are. And I think that is the most part to take away from this, because as Natalie addressed in the beginning with the contract, it does work both ways. There is this kind of agreement that yes, you're going to get paid, yes, you're doing these hours, yes, you're doing these days, but it's for this specific thing for you to complete, whatever job description that looks like, and additional, management requests. I think it's very important that everybody's on the same page, and I think that can sometimes get lost. So don't be worried to have those conversations. You can have somebody that is absolutely fantastic at their job and they get all tasks completed, but if they're late every day for the past 2 months and you've done nothing about it, that is still going to be a problem. Their performance is great, but you've actually upset the rest of your team by letting that go, because they're all turning up on time, and they're your steady eddies. Let's not upset them. But so I think if we can take anything away from it, it's just to be open, understand your team, understand what support you can put in place, and just talk.
Yeah, that's a good one, Faye. I like that. Yeah.
It's all about communication at the end of the day, isn't it? And it's about setting expectations and making sure people know what's expected of them, what the, when you take on a job, what are you meant to be doing?
Yeah.
What kind of benchmarks do you need to be hitting? And then it's a lot easier to have those conversations because you're coming from a point where you've all agreed the framework in the first place. And I think a lot of it comes down to just getting the basics in place first.
Yeah.
And that's where all the problems seem to stem from, is just not having that understanding between people, and that kind of, not even necessarily in their contract of employment, but just some kind of document that you do as you go along about what your kind of expectations are in the role.
If you're managing expectations from day one and you're very clear about what your organisation stands for, the type of culture that you're trying to create in there, and ultimately outlining what that looks like from the employee's responsibilities and accountabilities as well, is so important. If you do that from day one, generally you're on to a winning streak. Yes, you are going to have HR problems. Everybody does. There's not this whimsical, perfect employment space that actually exists. It never did. So to have the right support going forward is so important for businesses.
So do you have some clients where you think, we're on your team, you never have any issues because you've just got everything perfect the whole time, you have a blessed existence where we don't really have to do very much because your team are amazing and nobody ever has any problems? Or is it something that everybody has to face?
Oh, everyone.
Yeah. Because you just, everybody has different teams, everybody has new employees, and what that brings with that, everybody puts their best foot forward on interview and likely in their probation period, but it's only when we get into the crux of what the typical norms of what their working environment is, the problems start to come out. So that is on any industry, any level. Any business, any company is going to come across this, because these are people, and as mentioned before, people aren't walking policies. They don't just do what we set out to tell them to do. Everyone has their own opinion, mind, and what they believe is what they're going to do. So yeah, it's just managing what that looks like.
Yeah.
And is it all getting more difficult now because a lot of people are working from home some of the time, and it's a lot harder to kind of be aware of how well people are performing necessarily, or whether they're pulling their weight? There's always this suspicion when people are working from home that, are they actually getting their head down and working, or are they a little bit distracted? Are they, doing the washing, or, I have so many distractions when I'm working from home. Literally, you try and get some work done, and then children need their nappies changing and things, and stuff does happen. And has it made life of a manager more difficult?
I think it has, because there's that you've got to manage somebody that isn't within your view, but this comes down to trusting your employees. This comes down to you can measure that in what work is being completed. You can get IT records if you just so wish to, if you want to see what's being done. I think having that communication, making sure they're coming in on Teams calls and what that looks like, and reporting into, I think it's very important not to leave somebody completely isolated within their own home, and it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. That can't happen. But I think with creating, again, we go back to expectations of what that looks like for that person working from home. It can work. It's been proven that it can work, but you've got to trust your staff to do what you've set them out to do.
I think it should be about outcomes. It should be about how well you're performing the job, not about how many minutes a day you're spending working, or whether you're constantly available to answer an email within 30 seconds. Yeah. It should be, are you hitting the targets expected of you in the role, doing it however you want? I mean, some people might want to work for 2 or 3 hours and then catch up on their emails in the evening while they're watching EastEnders. Yeah. Some people get their head down and then they want to turn the laptop off at 5:30 and not be contactable anymore. It's different for different people, isn't it? It
is, absolutely. And this is definitely going to come down with what works for what business. Some people, maybe if it's more of maybe a call center approach, but from home, yes, you're going to have to kind of be there to take the calls. But if it works and you've had that agreed with management that is what you're going to do, again, tell them. If your manager calls you at 12 o'clock, but you've decided to take a point out of the day to either, your child to nursery or do whatever you're going to do. Make them aware. Don't just kind of be AWOL. Don't just not be answering the phone or emails. If your manager knows that that is what is the agreed, working arrangement, then I can't see any problem in it. But only managers are going to know what works for them and works for the business.
Do you think a lot of the time the reason that staff wouldn't tell you that that's what they're doing, dropping their kids off to nursery, or they're going to take a couple of hours at lunchtime to go for a walk, is because they're concerned about how you're going to react as a manager? So they don't want to tell you because they think you're going to say no, or you're going to get told off, or they might say okay, but it will be remembered and it's a black marker.
The little black book comes out. Oh no.
I've made a note.
I have actually worked for managers like that in my previous life, not in my HR capacity, just to be clear. But yeah, crikey, I remember that, and I felt like any little move that I was going to make, it would be noted in this, this mythical black book that existed.
Oh no, the worst thing is when you do something wrong and then as you get told off, they bring up everything that you've done that's annoyed them in the last 6 months, like a relationship. It is terrible.
Crikey, yeah. So you do find that, but we're finding that it's actually the employees with the little black books these days, and they'll remember every little thing that their employer has done. But instead of raising it at the time, I mean, at the moment, I'm dealing with grievances where things have happened 4 or 5 years ago. And obviously that's well out of time. But at the same time, the employee feels the need to be bringing this up, and they've bottled it up for all this time. But not because they didn't want to raise it at the time. It's because now it's relevant to them, because now they want to try and raise some sort of claim against the company. So you do find it happens.
As an employer, can you not say, if this was such an issue, why did you not mention it in the last 4 years? Surely, if it bothered you, you'd have said something.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is the message that employees don't seem to get, is that one of the things we'd hope that if any employees listen to this, because obviously we're very much, geared towards small businesses and employers on this podcast, but we may get the occasional employee listen. And if that's the case, don't bottle it up. You must make it relevant and have it recorded at the time. Don't bottle it up and leave it for years, because essentially it makes investigations very difficult. People won't remember those incidences that have taken place, and most people may have even left the company by that point, because the average time frame of people staying within jobs is around 2 years now. It's not a job for life mentality anymore.
That's an interesting point though, isn't it? That if your grievance is against a former manager, have you still got some kind of recompense from the company that employed them when you're... And I think it's very interesting if you look at what's going on at the moment with Harrods, and obviously there was some terrible stuff going on with Mohammed Al Fayed, and the organisation that he was running is still exists, and people are saying, we couldn't say anything at the time, but these are our grievances. It's still the responsibility of the organisation. The guy is dead and gone, but the organisation is still responsible for what happened under its roof.
I mean, employment law applies whether you employ one person or, like Harrods does, thousands of people. It's a really awful case, this, and what this would fall under in terms of legal side of things would be either whistleblowing or grievances, depending on the detail around the cases that are involved. It's obviously incredibly high profile, but ultimately, a lot of people will probably be thinking, well, why didn't they raise this back at the time? Because again, these cases, yes, people might remember bits and pieces to it, which doesn't help the victims in this case. But it's the same if you're looking at a criminal capacity, really, where HR and employment law can only do so much. What's actually happened at Harrods is essentially a criminal investigation that potentially is going on. With the new changes in law coming in October, you want to be doing everything you can to prevent such behaviours within these organisations, and it will become law. And if businesses don't take steps in order to protect the duty of care of their staff or prevent sexual harassment within the workplace, then they could be subject to employment tribunals or even heavy fines. So they need to be on board with the way that the world is going, and that these behaviours just simply aren't acceptable.
And I think also with these kind of cases where it's very much institutionalized, you can see why people wouldn't want to come forward, because who are you going to complain to when you're complaining about the person that owns the business? You know, you've got no further point of complaint at that stage, and you just feel like, you know, you can understand why people would wait to make their grievances known until they feel like they can do.
It's a really sad situation all round, and I think that even people that may be working at Harrods now may feel some sort of feeling of guilt, perhaps, because they are working in an organisation where the reputation is essentially tarnished. I mean, it's a world famous store. We've seen it with other big names on the high street, but for different reasons, and you know, that's more around employment practices and things like that. But businesses, whether, as I said, whether they're small or whether they're large, they are all accountable for their actions and for those behaviours that go on. They should be doing everything they can to prevent it. But the age-old question is, well, actually, do they know how to take those steps? And again, this is what Faye and I spend a lot of our time educating people on.
And if you are looking at things like reputational risk as something that's very important to any business, and doing what you can to protect yourself against that, that's an investment that needs to be made in the way that your company is run, your culture, because it's protecting itself from the things that can go wrong if you don't get these things
100%.
right.
And as a business owner myself, the reputation of my brand is incredibly important. Faye will vouch for that, and Mark will vouch for that as well. I didn't build a business just to become a millionaire or something like that. You know, people do have these aspirations, and you see the effects on Instagram is that it's more about the person behind the business than the brand itself. I set out to create a brand, and yes, it is growing. I'm very lucky to be in the position that I'm in. We've worked incredibly hard as a team, but if there was any risk to that reputation, then of course I have to mitigate that, and I'm accountable for those actions and behaviours. And as the company continues to grow, I have to ensure that we have the right culture and that people feel welcomed and safe as part of that culture. And that's the priority that businesses really should be looking at.
It's a lot harder as the business grows, though, isn't it? It's easier when you're all sat in the office together and there's 3 or 4 of you, but when you've got multiple branches and you've got lots of staff, that's where it really becomes something that you need processes to get that culture disseminated down through the whole organisation.
Yeah, this is why you empower managers to, 1, have the tools to be able to do the job, to nip those issues in the bud when they arise, and to know what those processes look like if something serious arises. Because a lot of managers will go, whoa, you know, when that, I'm sure that when that email hit one of the desks in Harrods, that they probably went, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? And how do we work our way through this? So I know that that's probably how a lot of people would see that, even if it is just a small grievance, perhaps it can be really off-putting for managers. So knowing what the process is and knowing how to do it, and if they don't, get the advice to know how to do it and handle it, because it gets out of hand really quickly and that reputational damage can follow. So it's important to practice what you preach and to have full visibility of that organisation, how the managers are performing in running those branches, for example, so that we're then able to have a really clear view as to, you know, do we have the right values, do we have the right culture, and are we practicing what we preach is so important these days. And you know, the press are very, very hot on it. They're very ready to name and shame people if they do see these unethical practices.
And I think a lot of the time things go on in organisations that other members of the board have a little bit of a sniff of, but they're not entirely sure, and it's not necessarily their area of responsibility. And it's not that they're sweeping it under the carpet, it's just they're turning a blind eye. They're not wanting to believe that something like that is going on. And you've got to have that, not, I don't know if it's safeguarding, but that kind of accountability around the boardroom table to all be looking at each other and seeing how you're running your side of the business and making sure it's all being done ethically and above board and appropriately. And you know, when somebody is doing something wrong and they know it, they're going to hide that, they're going to cover it up, and you've got to be vigilant and make sure that you spot when that kind of thing is going on.
Yeah, and I think that's a message really for our fellow HR colleagues on this, is that they will often be the last ones to find out, whereas if there is that support and guidance in place from the HR team in the first place, then these things can be resolved quite quickly. I mean, obviously you can't eradicate behaviours of an individual, that is really difficult, but I can completely understand the position that those people are now in. It's a no-win situation for either party, and now from a Harrods perspective, he's no longer at the helm. Obviously he's been gone for a while, but it's one of those where they're left carrying the can. So again, it's about saying, well, it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO or whether you're somebody who works in admin. You have to all have that level of accountability to know what those behaviours are and what is and is not acceptable in the workplace.
So what would your advice be to somebody, say they're working for a big organisation and they know that their boss is doing something really wrong, but they don't feel like they can say anything to them because they are the boss? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? Should you call the police?
I think it depends what it is. It's always dependent on what this situation would be. If it is something where somebody potentially has been assaulted, then absolutely the police would be involved. When it comes to an employment law perspective, they have to know and understand their processes and procedures. And if that person is raising that in good faith, it depends in terms of, whether they're prepared to put their head above the parapet, so to speak. And that is so hard for somebody to do, especially if you've got a lot of young people coming into the world of work right now, and they're not going to know all of this stuff until something happens, or it may personally impact them. But it's more about looking at those established members of staff that would know what those practices look like, and either reporting it to their HR team, or some companies may have an employee assistance program, for example, that would be able to give them advice on how to approach it from somebody else that doesn't know them, the company, or the situation. Sometimes it helps to speak to someone outside that can, steer them in the right direction. But yeah, it's very difficult to tell, depending upon that situation and helping that person.
Well, that's a good shout, actually. And a lot of the time when you first join a company, you get given this whole pack of information that goes in your desk drawer and you never look at it again. But somewhere in there might be a helpline number that you can phone when you have issues that you need some advice on, or if your organisation is a member of the Chamber of Commerce, they've got a phone number there that you can ring for advice, or the CBI, or some of these other organisations. But there's lots of people that will help you, and Citizens Advice as well is another good place to go to. So there is help available, and obviously you guys would be happy to give advice, especially in a serious situation like that.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And Faye and I are good listeners, so it's there's no judgment when people come through to us, whether they've adhered to a policy or not. That's not our position to judge people. And I think that's coming back to your point earlier about feeling judged. A lot of people coming to us do feel like they're going to get told off by big bad HR, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Absolutely. Okay, well that was really interesting. That went very deep into that.
Episode 3 got deep.
It did go down to the nitty-gritty as you promised us. So is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we wrap things up?
No, just a big thank you to you, Chris, for having us and producing the show and all the hard work you put into it. Faye and I, we've mentioned to so many people that we wouldn't do the show if it wasn't for you. So thank you so much for having us.
No, thank you. I'm enjoying this. So if you have any questions for the next episode, please get in touch, because this is all about dealing with the subjects that you want us to be talking about. So if there's something that's troubling you, or something that you can see on the horizon that you want to be talking us to be talking about, then get in touch. All the contact details are on the podcast or the video if you're watching this on YouTube, and you can get in touch, and we will deal with that in the next episode. But thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.